When you think about network performance, start by thinking of what you've done in your physical network with your physical servers. You've probably created separate networks or subnets to isolate traffic from one group of servers and clients and another, and creating a routing scenario where the only time they cross the router is when they need to. And so that isolates that network traffic. You've probably done things with servers like add additional network interface cards, maybe even teamed those NICs together for better bandwidth. And of course, it comes down to the hardware. You always want to use the best quality, highest speed network interface card on those servers that need the most bandwidth. And all of these practices you can still do with the Hyper-V network virtualization, and that's really the point to all of the flexibility. You've seen a couple of options already that have been built in for you to work with. Let's take a look at one of those again. So the Virtual Switch Manager, when we created an external network to put our VMs on, this is where we had a physical network adapter, and the option enable single root IO virtualization is a performance enhancing option. It allows you to use those performance features that are directly on that network interface card. And so you definitely want to use tactics like this as you set this up, but there's still more to this. We want to have the really high speed, good quality network interface cards installed into our Hyper-V host. You might even configure NIC teaming on those cards in the Hyper-V host to get the most throughput through them. Now, a little bit later, we'll show you configuring NIC teaming in virtual machines, but think of it also on the host itself. We also created multiple virtual networks so that we could isolate traffic, just like you would on a real physical network. And these kind of practices will allow you to, well, get the most for your money when you're setting up all of your networking and trying to control the bandwidth. Now, you're still going to have a couple of issues where a particular VM might be grabbing more network bandwidth than you want it to, and we can control that as well. Think back, and I'm going to cancel out of this, but think back to in the previous module when we were working with storage and we were looking at storage quality of service. We could control how many IOPS were being utilized. We could set a maximum amount of IOPS. And if you think back to the very first module of this course, when we were looking at memory and dynamic memory, we could control how important the VM was in getting its dynamic memory, or maybe the VM wasn't as important and it could sacrifice some of its memory. Well, we can do the same thing with the networking, and we can go in and control a VM and how much bandwidth it can use. So I'm going to go into settings, and let's go to those network adapters down here. There's a network adapter. And notice we have bandwidth management, and I can enable bandwidth management. And very similar to how we did this with storage in the IOPS, we can control the minimum and the maximum bandwidth that this VM can use. Perhaps this VM, it's no reason for it to go over 10 megabits per second for bandwidth consumption. Now, there might be an errant process or something like that that sometimes makes this VM grab more or want to talk more, but we want to throttle it back or control it. I've got other VMs that may need a higher level of network communication. You know, you always got to keep in mind that we've still are, even though we're doing all this virtualization, it ties back to physical resources, and they're not infinite. We've got a limitation on those physical resources, and we're sharing those physical resources across our virtualization platform. So if I've got one VM that's grabbing way too much bandwidth and making the other VMs communicate slower, well, I've got a couple of tactics now. First of all, I can find the VM that's using too much bandwidth and throttle it with the bandwidth management. I could also use some of those tactics of creating network isolation for it as well. While we're in the network settings for this virtual machine, this is also where you would enable the hardware acceleration. Notice how I opened it up and went to, I'm going to go to hardware acceleration. So one of the first things is this is what can be offloaded to that physical network adapter if you have these features available. And you'll notice down here at the bottom, remember we created the virtual switch, we enabled the virtual switch to be able to have single root IO virtualization so we could use some of these hardware features. This is where we tell the VM that it can use those features. And we have some other features that, depending upon the physical hardware, such as the virtual machine queue, that will help reduce some of the CPU required for the virtual machine as it's dealing with its networking tasks. IPsec offloading, if you have SSL and certificates set up, these features can be enabled for that hardware acceleration. But we're still not done. We're going to look at an additional configuration feature for your network interface cards, and that's how you work with the MAC addresses.